We are so delighted to have this opportunity to share some really exciting work that is being done by Duke students as part of a project that is being supported by the BASS initiative. And before we begin, I do want also to say, with just genuine appreciation, thank you to Professor Deandra Rose and the entire team at Paulus for creating an opportunity for our students to share their work in progress, to have a conversation about why their work matters. And I'm sure you're going to see just how inspiring and impactful their work is in a very short period of time. So before I introduce them, I also want to say that I'm joined by a remarkable team in this BASS project. It is collaborative research at its best. Ana Ramirez, the Associate in Research at the Hart Leadership Program. A graduate student in the Political Science Department, Tina Tucker, who has been a remarkable force for us in helping our students shape their work. And my co-conspirator, Alexandra Cooper, of the Social Science Research Initiative. And the four of us have really been shepherding and learning and pushing a large group of 24 students to confront head-on the democracy challenges in a pandemic, and also to use this opportunity, this moment in time, to peer into what are really systemic challenges in our democracy and to find ways of learning by doing and learning from this moment. So we are really excited to share their work, what they're going to do in the next hour. Each team, we have 10 teams. Each team will present their work in about 2 minutes, and we will then, and I'll give a kind of thematic shape to the projects. And then we're going to hear from two different leading reformers in democracy across our state and across our nation. Tomas Lopez, the Executive Director of Democracy North Carolina, and technology willing, Congressman John Sarbanes of Maryland, who I will introduce in a little bit, but they are going to offer their perspectives, their insights on this important student work. And then we'll have a chance for Q&A and questions and dialogue at the end. So in one tight hour, we're going to cover a lot of terrain. So I do want to encourage you, if you have questions, to be forming them, and we'll use that in the Q&A section. Okay, so let me just say one thing as well before we start about the origins of this larger project, what makes it cohere, and also what we hope we will do with it over the course of this year. So the BASS projects are for a year, 2 semesters, and because we were facing this remarkable election, we decided to flip the way we might normally do this work. Normally, you might have a problem, you might have a question you're interested in, you would do research, and then in the second semester, you would really do that research and dig into it. We realized that we were facing, in real time, at this moment, one of the greatest challenges to democracy as we know it in this pandemic. And so we have kind of flipped the pedagogical script and asked our students to quickly diagnose a problem with a community partner who could help inform their research, and then dig right in to coming up with a potential solution to that challenge, and then also put it to work in the election. And so where we are in the semester is that each of these teams has already been thinking hard, creatively about a democracy challenge and a potential pilot that would redress those problems. And they're in the process already of putting these pilots, these deliverables, we call them, or these treatments, as Alexandra Cooper put it beautifully, into practice, and certainly by the beginning of early vote, they're going to be implementing their ideas to try to see if they can learn more about the problem, but also more about the solution. So democracy is aspirational, as we all know. It's a work in progress. And part of what we are inspired by, what I'm inspired by, is how forthright, how clear, discerning, unflinching these students have been in recognizing the challenges that we face and then going right at the problem and trying. So we want to have a conversation not only about the problem, but the solution. And I think that's the spirit of this panel and this whole conference, which is reimagining the vote, even as we begin to vote. So, okay, I'm going to go through now. I'm going to just bring in and add students as I introduce each team real quickly. I just ask you unmute and then present. This will take about 20 minutes or so. Each team has 2 minutes. So I don't want to be a strict timekeeper, but I do want to remind you that we don't have as much time as we would like. So the first 2 teams that we're going to present are on the theme of mobilizing college students. And we'll begin with the team, How Best to Mobilize College Students, Jamel Smith, Amber Park, and Nemea Rao.
Hi, everyone. Both of our groups, Mobilizing College Students to Vote and Persuading Students Not Inclined to Vote, have the common goal of mobilizing the vote of Duke students for the quickly approaching 2020 election. So our group, which is Mobilizing College Students to Vote, is specifically targeting the issue of lack of information and resources for freshman students on campus. And voter turnout among college students is historically one of the lowest rates, which has been perpetuated by decades of voter suppression. And we found that the main barrier between Duke students and the ballot is not knowing when, how, and where to vote, and that this lack of information about voting has undoubtedly been exacerbated by the pandemic. So working with Duke Votes, which is a nonpartisan student-led organization here on campus, we are focusing on the freshman population who are new to campus, and we're taking advantage of the existing relational organizing system of resident assistants, better known to most of you as RAs. And relational organizing is, in short, using friends and family to mobilize voters, which has been proven to be one of the most effective ways to mobilize voters. Since each residence hall on campus has a designated RA, we felt that this was the easiest way to get the message to the most students possible. We're currently organizing hall trips to Karsh Alumni Center, which is the early voting station on campus, for RAs to take their residents during the early voting period from October 15th to 31st. RAs can sign up for a 30-minute time slot during which they can bring their residents to Karsh and make sure all their students cast a ballot. Voting during the early voting period has also given us the flexibility of making sure that students who aren't registered to vote can do so on the day of. And now I'll pass it on to Daisy.
Daisy, if you can unmute, bring your team in.
Yes, sorry. So as Maya said, both of our groups have the common goal of mobilizing Duke students. So voter apathy and various barriers to voting tend to be a prominent issue among young voters. Historically, young voters have some of the lowest turnout rates in the nation. My team, Persuading Students Not Inclined to Vote to Do So, is working to target Duke undergraduates who did not vote in the 2020 primaries and seeing if direct contact can influence their likelihood of voting. In conjunction with Duke Votes, we have identified 455 Duke undergraduates who did not vote in the primaries, all with publicly listed phone numbers. Using text banking software provided by our partners, You Can Vote, we plan to text each undergraduate and try to identify why they did not vote in the primary elections. Research on the personal and institutional barriers related to non-voting reveals that some young voters are overwhelmed with all the regulations and the responsibilities that go along with voting. Therefore, while shaming people into voting can be an effective strategy, we've developed a script that considers the possibility that students can be overwhelmed or scared of voting and aim to provide enough grace so the students don't feel attacked or shamed and instead feel safe enough to divulge any barriers that prevented them from voting or reasons they didn't vote. We specifically chose not to disclose the information that we are aware they didn't vote. This is because we felt that if we did, they had a higher chance of becoming defensive and uncooperative, which would have been counterproductive to our ultimate goals. We have worked to identify possible barriers such as unable to register, confused about how to vote, unaware of polling locations, etc., to see if through targeting their direct obstacles, we increase voter turnout among this group. After the election, we will evaluate whether our strategy worked by looking at voting records and comparing the voting rates of those we had a conversation with to those who never responded to our original messages. At first glance, a personalized conversation with fellow students may seem obvious as a way to drive voter engagement. However, we want to provide evidence to determine if this is a worthwhile endeavor for organizers or if their time could be better spent.
Thank you. Well said, Daisy. And I should add that I did not introduce that whole team. And that team is also is Jesse Halverson, Trinity Wenzel Wertheim, and Daisy. So really exciting work being done, and will certainly boost Duke's totals, I'm sure. So we'll go from mobilizing college students, how, to documenting students' political voices, which are often ignored in elections. So the next team is the Documenting Democracy in a Pandemic, Jerry Lau and Abigail Phillips.
Hi, everyone. So our goal is to reach out and mobilize young students to vote. And especially in this pandemic, we are in a unique challenge because we are limited to the traditional forms of voter outreach. We can't do door-to-door canvassing as normal. So we're really focusing on the effectiveness of online messaging. So far we've been looking at the different types of messaging and looking at the different characteristics and categories that really would galvanize and encourage young students to register and to vote. And we are in the process of creating content on YouTube and TikTok to reach out to these voters and inform these students.
Yeah. So in the process, as we undergo trying to create this content, we are trying to work within a framework that use the most effective way to create a good product, as to combine information dissemination and positive, enthusiastic messaging. So we want to structure our analysis of the problem around the idea that people don't vote not because they're not motivated generally, but because they're encountering structural barriers. So we want to provide ways to overcome that and not shame them into and make them feel like it's their fault, because it's really the way that the system is set up. And so I'm really excited to get going on that. We've created our first video, and I think that TikTok is going to be a really exciting way to do this, because the algorithm, because leveraging the algorithm will allow us to reach more people, as well as using my student networks to disseminate to the Duke population at large.
In addition, just really quick, we're also partnering with the Why Votes Challenge with the Hart Leadership Program. We're hoping to really also look at those videos and excited to review and kind of see how we can really effectively broaden the reach of those videos to the student population too.
Thank you, Abigail and Jerry. And that's a quick shout out to the Why Vote Challenge, which, if you are not aware of, it is an opportunity to create a 30-second PSA persuading someone to vote who would not likely vote. And that can be uploaded to the Hart Leadership site through this coming Monday, and prizes and winners announced a week from today, the first day of early voting. Thank you. The next group, and we are a little bit different order students than what we had suggested. So we are going to now go to in the context of documenting students' political voices, we have a terrific group working on single issue voter participation, Isabel Rewick and Paul Kim.
All right, hello everyone. So our group, Single Issue Voters and Voter Participation, is mainly designed to parse what single issues voters care about and whether or not these issues motivate them to go out to the polls. And so for this particular project, we decided to focus on young Asian American voters, specifically Korean American voters, due to the fact that traditionally Asian Americans have been traditionally ignored as a voter demographic. And within the context of this pandemic, which has seen a lot of anti-Asian sentiment and an increase in race-related conversation, we felt that it was very, very important to see if Black Lives Matter, which has been the predominant topic of discussion within this country with regards to race relations, can possibly galvanize Asian American voters, specifically Korean American voters, to go out to the polls.
Yeah, so in terms of an intervention, we want to tell a story leveraging social media campaigns, which have become increasingly widely used over the course of the last couple of months to communicate with other people amidst the pandemic. And we want to tell a story that links the Black Lives Matter movement, which has become more prominent over the last couple of months, with the pro-democracy movements in South Korea in the 1980s, which were led by labor activists and students. And as Paul said, our final result, we're hoping to see that our messaging will raise more consciousness in Korean American students, particularly on campus, and to see that in the end, this will influence them to go out, vote, and vote in higher numbers. Thank you.
Thank you, Isabel and Paul. Such good work. Okay, so we are sort of quickly going through these wonderful topics. The next group describing as fighting misinformation, which of course is one of the hallmarks of this particular moment. And how do we do that? Really a challenging topic. So we have two teams that in different ways are going about that. The first is fighting it directly, and is Jenna Walensky Truong and Haley Cush, and they're going to talk about their work.
Alrighty. Hi guys. So my name is Tree and I'm working with Jenna and Haley on the Misinformation project. And so I want to talk about misinformation a little bit because misinformation on social media represent a significant danger to the 2020 elections. So if a citizen learned incorrect information about voting or about a candidate or about their policies, it may, affect their ability to participate in this election fully and fairly. So for our project, we're working with Melissa Price-Grom. She's the director of North Carolina Voters for Clean Elections to identify social media posts that contain misinformation. So what we do is we submit information about these posts on a website that, she directs us to. And then, there are people from the organization that will look at these posts and, have the posts taken down. While we're doing this, we're mindful of a certain minority groups, such as, Hispanics voters or African American voters, and, learn like how these misinformation affects these groups. We're also investigating how different age groups, such as first-time voters or old voters, and, how they are being affected by these misinformation, because on individual feed, there are, different kind of posts that appear on the, your feed, and we can't combat those effectively if we don't know who are our target groups. Some of the key aspects that we're hoping to work on is understanding who's posting the misinformation online, and we're trying to work closely with Facebook, Twitter, and understand how their algorithm in selecting posts on user feed to combat misinformation more effectively. So hopefully by the end of the by the end of the election, but hopefully in sometime soon, we can create an interactive tool or maybe an infographics that educate voters about how to spot misinformation and how they can participate in our project as well.
Great. Wow. There's a solution. Okay. The next team is fighting disinformation in effect, but about really public access to the ballot. And so this is a transportation team who is responding to an opportunity to create better transportation and better knowledge about the transportation that exists, Sana and Grant. And before I let you start, I just want to say that this morning, the Durham City Council and the mayor just agreed to the transportation plan that they're part of, which means there will be they're calling it a voting express directly from the downtown bus station to early vote sites to give public transit riders the greatest access they can have to the ballot throughout every day of early vote. So with that, Sana.
Yeah, so that's very exciting to hear that they're putting that in motion. But I'll start by kind of introducing the problem that we're working on a bit more. So we believe that many people don't vote, not because they don't want to, but simply because they're unable to, because they don't have the means to vote or they don't have the access. So maybe they don't have time, or maybe they don't have access to transportation to polling locations. So this is what we're focusing on. And we're investigating whether providing this access to free transportation from downtown Durham to these polling locations will increase voter participation. And so Grant will talk a bit more about our methods.
Yeah, so it's definitely very exciting to hear that that's finally going to motion. The specific intervention Sana and I are working on is working on how we can effectively communicate that this opportunity exists to specific groups that might be most able to benefit from it. Specifically, people without North Carolina's driver's licenses. So currently we're working on different methods about how we can do outreach to those groups, such as through text banking or phone banking, as well as just simply like putting posters up around Durham. And so through this, we hope to amplify the work that Professor Peck's citizens group is doing. And additionally, we want to see if we can measure the effects of this intervention by doing polls, essentially, on the buses or around the time that voters are using this opportunity.
Fantastic. Boy, that's exciting. So one thing I just want to point out, I love how your research, all of these teams, the research and the advocacy are actually shaping each other. They're learning better questions to ask by doing and jumping right into a democracy challenge. So with that in mind, the next group, many of these groups are advocating this, but this is really a couple of teams working on improving access to the ballot. And we have two teams working on language barrier research, and language barriers are quite prominent in North Carolina. So the first team to speak is going to be Adam Israelovitz and Garrett Allen.
Hi, everyone. So we kind of locked in on a topic about in North Carolina, there's a fundamental lack of information for Hispanic-speaking voters in North Carolina. That's because they're under 5% of the population, so they're not guaranteed as many voting rights as other minority populations. So, for example, in Arizona, you can have a ballot in Spanish, but in North Carolina, because they're under 5% representation, there's no Spanish ballot allowed. So because of this, we kind of attacked this lack of information problem in a twofold approach. So the first thing we're doing is we're going to have a bilingual mailer sent out to counties with the most Hispanic speaking populations in North Carolina. So we're going to do Mecklenburg and Wake counties. We're going to have a mailer explaining, one, all the things they need to know about voting early and voting on election day and the differences, and then showing early voting sites there and making key distinctions, as well as we're going to have a description of more local statewide candidates, such as the North Carolina Attorney General and some Supreme Court seats, explaining what those roles are to them. And then we're actually working with Poder en Sí, which is a nonprofit Spanish organization in North Carolina, to work on this mailer. And then the second thing we're doing is a translation effort in conjunction with, again, Poder en Sí, but also with the Duke Spanish Department. And we're writing policy platforms for a lot of local candidates, so voters understand who they're voting for, and then we're going to publish these translated efforts onto the Votemos site, which again is through Poder en Sí. And we're going to try to market this and send it to as many Hispanic-speaking voters as possible in the state before the election. So that's kind of our twofold approach there.
Wow, that's great. Aiming high. The next group, also working on language barrier problems, Jeremy Carballo and Pineda and Shirley Mathur.
Hi, yeah. So our problem is that one out of every 6 North Carolinians under the age of 18 are Hispanics, and out of that population, 90% of those are U.S. citizens. That means that we have a large population that's about to be eligible to vote, but because they lack the social capital of other minorities or other majority groups, they may not be in the habit of voting. Their families may not know the information on how to vote, and they may not know the importance of voting. So we kind of have 2 goals we're trying to achieve through this project. Number 1 is increase youth Hispanic turnout. And number 2 is to utilize these youth Hispanics to convince and persuade the grander population of Hispanics in North Carolina that can vote, in order to persuade them to vote, teach them how to vote, and teach them about the common difficulties that may arise. And we're going to do this through a social media campaign using TikTok, Twitter, and Facebook. and Shirley is going to explain the social media campaign a little bit further.
Yeah, so as Jeremy mentioned, we're going to launch a social media campaign in which we're essentially going to focus on creating easily digestible content that we could send out to various groups, specifically on Facebook. So we're working with Votemos as well. And so they already have several groups set up on Facebook. So we're thinking of making different messaging and different content to put in these different groups to see what sort of messaging seems to get the most engagement, seems to be the most relevant and most impactful and actually helping people to get the information. And so that's also the component of our pilot that we plan on measuring to see going forward what sort of content would be best for us to invest in creating and spread out there.
Fantastic. Thanks so much. I should say, just as a quick word, every one of these projects is nonpartisan. There is no mention of candidates or parties. And the goal, as you can see, is to address what are systemic problems that supersede and transcend partisan identifications. So the last group that we're going to hear from, and then we'll have comments briefly from our two guest speakers, and I'll introduce them momentarily. But we have the topic of simply voting in a pandemic, what we are getting ready to do if you haven't already done it. And so we have two teams that are looking into the challenges and the opportunities created by absentee balloting by mail. The first team is led by Chase Johnson, an MPP student, Emma Shokir, and Catherine Tomas, two undergraduates. Take it away.
Hi, so North Carolina is seeing unprecedented use of its absentee vote by mail system due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Over 1.2 million voters have requested an absentee ballot so far, and almost 400,000 absentee ballots have already been cast. The North Carolina State Board of Elections has released a ballot tracking tool called Ballot Tracks, which provides updates to voters about their mail-in ballots location and status via phone, email, and/or text notifications. Our team is working to increase awareness of and enrollment in the Ballot Track system. We are implementing a direct outreach campaign to independent, unaffiliated, and third-party voters in select North Carolina counties with pending or not yet approved absentee ballots. We are focusing on Durham, Pasquotank, Transylvania, Northampton, and Halifax counties. These counties had high or abnormally low rates of rejection in the 2016 election. We are contacting these voters by phone and mail to inform them of the Ballot Track system and encourage them to enroll. Within our phone bank script, we will ask voters if they have heard of Ballot Tracks and if they have enrolled in the system. If they tell us they have not yet registered, we plan to walk them through the simple enrollment steps. For voters who do not have phone banks, or for voters who do not have phone numbers in the public data, we plan to mail a flyer with the information about Ballot Tracks and the simple instructions on how to sign up. Ballot Tracks is not the solution to mail-in ballot concerns unless voters know it exists and enroll in the program. We believe that our pilot project will boost enrollment in Ballot Tracks, allowing voters to stay informed about their absentee ballot and ultimately increase the likelihood that their mail-in ballot will be counted. Our project is voter-facing, focusing on keeping voters informed of how their ballot is processed and potentially cured. In addition to keeping voters informed, the success of Ballot Tracks and absentee balloting depends on how county boards of elections run the process of rejecting and curing absentee ballots. And now I'll pass it over to Ben and Gwen.
Great, thank you. And similar to Catherine's group, Gwen and I have been looking at addressing these specific absentee ballot deficiencies, except with a particular emphasis on the involvement of county boards of elections across the state of North Carolina. And through analysis of absentee ballot requests and returns data provided by the North Carolina State Board of Elections, we found that non-white voters are significantly more likely to have deficient or spoiled ballots compared to white voters. And similarly, non-white voters are overall less likely to have their ballots returned and less likely to have to request ballots to begin with. And in conversations with researchers and democracy advocates in Watauga, Scotland, Northampton, Orange, and Durham counties, which altogether represent a pretty good cross-section of North Carolina voters, we've learned about the unique barriers that specific groups of voters face. Like for example, many Hispanic and Latinos, as the other groups have mentioned, require their ballots or envelope instructions to be translated, and others like African American voters and students have traditionally voted in person, so they're less familiar with the vote by mail process that we expect.
So to address the higher rates of spoiled absentee ballots among Black voters specifically, we're planning to send letters to county boards of election and local branches of the NAACP in the counties that Ben just mentioned. In these letters, we'll provide both groups with both quantitative and qualitative evidence about the disparities in spoiled ballot rates across racial and ethnic groups. Our recommendation to both groups is that they collaborate to provide Black voters with better information about the absentee voting by mail process. Ultimately, we hope this project will increase the rates at which Black voters successfully return their absentee ballots so that their votes will count.
Thank you so much, all of these wonderful students. To say it's inspiring to hear. Before we open it up, thank you, all of you, for presenting your ideas so well and effectively. I'm going to introduce two speakers who are going to comment briefly and just reflect, offer a few suggestions if they think of them, and or questions to the panelists, all of these students. And then we'll have a back and forth, and then we'll open it up to questions and answers. So Tomas Lopez is the Executive Director of Democracy North Carolina. He was previously counsel with the Democracy Program at the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU School of Law, a nonpartisan law and policy institute that seeks to improve the nation's systems of democracy and justice. And for anyone following voting rights, the Brennan Center has been this incubator of some of the best work, really, over the past 2 decades. As a voting rights attorney there, Tomas litigated against restrictive voting laws in federal court and partnered with advocates to advance and defend election reforms at the state level. Prior to joining DMNC, Tomas was a fellow with the Southern Poverty Law Center's Immigrant Justice Project, where he was part of efforts to challenge anti-immigration legislation in Alabama. He has also previously served as the Bacon Immigration Law and Policy Program Fellow at the University of Arizona, Rogers College of Law, where he co-authored a report on the impact of Arizona's immigration law on young people. And Tomas is a graduate of Duke University, of the Hart, took the SOL program at the Hart Leadership Program. And he also went to a school known as Yale, but that's probably the least impressive thing in his awesome resume. Tomas, and let me introduce both speakers and then you can go back and forth. We're also delighted to have Congressman John Sarbanes, 3rd District of Maryland, a Democrat who has been in the US Congress since 2007. He currently serves on the House Committee on Energy and Commerce, the House Subcommittee on Health, also the House Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations. And since 2017, Congressman Sarbanes has chaired the Democracy Reform Task Force, a bold effort in the House of Representatives to build a government that puts the public interests ahead of special interests. And he is the lead sponsor, organizer of H.R. 1, which was passed at the beginning of this previous term, a bill that would expand access to the ballot by taking aim at institutional barriers to voting, would also eliminate gerrymandering, would make universal voter registration automatic, would tackle big money, in many respects go even further than the Voting Rights Act if it should become law. So thank you. Congressman Sarbanes may not have video because he is, I believe, doesn't have direct internet, but we will be able to hear him. So maybe we could begin with reactions and questions from Tomas.
All right, thank you so much. Thanks everyone for being here. I'm really happy to be here. I think as Gunther described, I went through the Hart Leadership Program myself back in the day, and now, and I think played no small role, obviously, in being where I am now. I feel one of the things that's really cool, I will say, right before I get to sort of reactions, or here's a sort of top line reaction, right? I think one of the things that's really cool about this, just what you're doing, right, is it takes me back to when, I was a student, when I was a Duke student, and I was thinking about, what do I want to spend my time on? What are the things I'm interested in? Oh, wow, that sounds really like a great project, or that seems like something that I'd really like to spend my time on, because, as much as I really, like sort of the work that I'm in, when you do it every day, all day, especially at that peak of the election season, right, oftentimes your frame on it is, here's another problem you have to solve, and also like it's an exploding problem, so get on it immediately. And I think what's really great about the energy that you bring is to remind it, hey, these are really interesting questions, and they are challenging questions, and the relationship between their being interesting and being challenging is direct. You know, one of the things that stood out to me, the thought that kept coming through my mind as you all were presenting, and I recognize, right, these were really condensed presentations, and you all could talk a lot longer about them, is that, you know, in so many ways, right, they reflect the ways in which the questions of how do we get people to participate, who gets to participate, what motivates people, what demotivates people, those things are all tied into each other. And the question that kept popping up into my mind with every single one of these was, well, what have you all learned from one another so far that, you know, you may have applied to, you know, sort of the design of what you're doing, right? Because when I think about, you know, the question of, you know, what motivates people, right? The issues that motivate people, right? What's the relationship between somebody being really motivated to vote on, let's say, healthcare, right? And the barrier that is keeping them from casting a ballot, you know, let's say that barrier is transportation. And to what extent is, you know, transportation not only a barrier for voting for them, but a barrier to healthcare access, a barrier to, you know, high quality food in their neighborhood, right? You can go sort of down the whole list. And I don't know if I want to, you know, Gunther, I'll defer to you on sort of whether we want to sort of throw in for that dialogue, but that's one thing I'm really interested in. I'd say a second, you know, would be the extent, one thing I thought was really, and it gave me actually a little bit of, again, sort of optimism, right, was we've talked about, you know, we're talking about this election. What I didn't hear a lot about was what I think a lot of folks who are engaging with the election in, you know, voting rights spaces are talking about is the toxicity of the dialogue around it, right? I mean, Gunther, you referred to it at the top, right, about sort of the ways in which in many ways, right, our hold on democracy feels very tenuous right now. But, you know, all this stuff is really positive. And so I'm curious about, you know, the ways in which you considered, or, you know, maybe in turn dismissed, right, engaging with, you know, kind of the, you know, the more noxious side of, you know, what we're seeing in the political environment.
Fantastic questions. Let me, I want the students to think about them too, really, how they've learned from each other, and also this well said relationship between the problem or the solution, as well as the kind of almost dystopian look we have right now and what you're trying to create. Before we do that, I want to hear from Congressman John Sarbanes, and he can add, and then we can open it up. Okay, Congressman Sarbanes?
Yeah, Gunther, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, you're loud and clear. We see your name, but we hear you.
Okay.
Here.
All right, and I may come in and out, so I'll try to be quick so I can get my thoughts in front of everybody. First of all, thanks for the invitation. Secondly, outstanding presentations from the students. What struck me is I've been working for a number of years now in Washington to assemble reforms to address grievances that we're hearing from all over the country. The HR 1 bill that you mentioned was constructed based on input from all of our caucus members across the United States. And there were common themes. And many of the things that we are trying to address in HR 1 and the voting portion of that reform bill are exactly the things that your students are working on. And, you know, we're trying to facilitate better access to the ballot box. We're trying to diagnose and understand where the obstacles are and then prescribe solutions for federal elections that can leverage then similar kinds of changes at the state and local level. So most of the topics that were addressed in these presentations are ones that are foursquare within to people's access to the ballot box, including, by the way, a lot of the issues relating to disinformation and misinformation We have provisions on how these social media platforms should be more careful in terms of pulling down disinformation on election-related issues, as well as offering up positive, helpful, useful information to people at election time. So everybody's right on the money with these presentations. The question I had, the thing I'm very interested in is, it's clear that your students are super engaged by this and motivated and being very, very creative in the solutions that they are offering here. And I'd love to hear from the students how much they think their peers around them could be similarly engaged. And does that, for example, lead to the notion that you should make the kind of coursework that's embodied in this class part of a kind of core commitment at the college level? If this were the kind of thing that was offered up broadly or potentially even strongly recommended in the ways that academia can do, would there be a positive response from other students? How much appetite is there once you really dig in to these sort of issues to pursue them in the way that your students have? I'd be very curious about that, because I think that could be quite hopeful as well. So thanks for the opportunity to listen in. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much. And just for full disclosure, John is a dear friend and a college roommate, which is one reason he's here, but not the only reason. And it's important to.
I would say, Gunther, that I'm here despite the fact that we were college roommates. So.
Fair enough. So yeah, friendship and election and democracy work, they go together. So it's a great question. I think we have 3 great questions. So maybe we could, what I would ask the students to do is to unmute and also open your video. If anyone would like to comment directly, and you can direct your answer reflection to either Tomas or to Congressman Sarbanes, and I'll call on you if you could also, how should we do it? If you could, Anna, do you want to help?
Yeah, hi. So you have the ability to raise your hand as a panelist. So if you go ahead and raise your hand, we can see that and call on you, and that way we can facilitate this process.
Thank you. Yeah, so raise your hand so we can see. So the first, we could take it one question at a time. I think the question of one of the first ones that really Tomas raised about the toxicity of the dialogue and of this moment. And are you, yeah, I think he said it really well, how it's also connected to these positive.
Yeah, so first up we have Trinity.
Yeah.
Hi, yeah, so I think for me at least, I've been doing a lot of elections work all summer. I was a fellow for You Can Vote, and I still am in the fall. And I think honestly, the reason I care so much about this work is because I like to remain positive despite all of the negativity. I think that, at least in the interactions that I've had with other young people, seeing just infectious positivity, even around like such a stressful and honestly emotionally taxing time, really helps other people stay just as motivated. I know at least in like my group, when we hit a wall with, for example, when I was building the text banking list, I had to manually look up every single Duke student and find their class year. And I definitely got really exhausted. But when I realized that I was doing it in conjunction with a lot of like Duke Votes volunteers, it made it a lot more worthwhile. And then we shared our, confusion and difficulty, just navigating like a list given to us from the Board of Elections, or just all these like little things. I think honestly, like the way that you remain positive is through others and the like connections that you have with other people and the work that you're doing. And then when you can honestly see the visible impacts of what you're working on, especially like with voter registration, just like to sit at a table for 2 hours and look in front of you of the 50 forms that you've collected, it's like, it's all worth it, I think. It's just trying to find little victories every day is something that I've personally really focused on during this work.
So well said. Thank you. Well reflected. Do we have other reflections on this dystopian recovery moment that we live in? Maybe. Anaya.
Yeah, so I kind of want to second what Trinity was saying, and I think that our group has definitely felt that as well. A lot of our classmates, just like talking to them and hearing them be so confused about the voting process and what it's like to vote in America, and like what our system is like, and they're very discouraged and confused about everything, kind of motivates us and allows us to recognize like the responsibility that we have to make sure that they get the information we need. And I just want to second that we're definitely really motivated, despite everything that's happening, that we're motivated to continue making sure that all of our peers and our classmates and our friends have the resources they need to successfully vote this election. And that when, like for me, especially like when a friend or a student comes and asks me a question because we are already working on this and they're like, hey, like I think you might have the answer, I think that's really rewarding for us, and it kind of pushes us to keep going because our work is having an impact, no matter how small.
Having an impact, right on. Jamel.
Yes, I would agree as well. It's knowing that even though the situation is bad, knowing that we can help make a change, however small, for the better, that really keeps me going and motivates me.
I love it. Thanks. Emma.
So I think on the topic of misinformation and disinformation, particularly for our group, which is working on absentee ballots, we're kind of the mindset that more information in the hands of the voters is going to create more trust in the absentee ballot process. So the state proposed ballot tracks as a solution, and we think that not enough people are enrolled in it, and if they have that tool to know where their ballot is and know what stage it's at, they're going to have more trust in the actual voting process. So.
Yes, I love the way you framed that, Emma, because in fact, there's a premise there. We're sort of trying out, we're both, sometimes it's the aspiration that's leading to a kind of pilot, and then you're also going to reevaluate in light of what we learned. So it's really takes a kind of courage to do that. Daisy.
Yeah, I also think it's really interesting to see how like being aware of the negativity and the very like politically charged situation that we're in affects our research itself, because I know at least for my group, which is reaching out to people through text banking to try to identify why they didn't vote in the primaries, and I mentioned this a little bit, but it's almost like people don't want to admit that they didn't vote because as Professor Peck said in one of our meetings, admitting you didn't vote is admitting like you're like a horrible person. Like there's like a stigma behind it that people don't want to admit. And so we, at least I know my team was very much aware that like people had this notion that like you have to at least pretend to care for this election because it like people are making such a big deal because it is a big deal. And that you have to be like very careful how you phrase certain questions and like how you go about reaching out to people to try to increase their vote and not shame them into having a terrible experience.
Well said. Great insights. Let me turn to the, because this actually, before we come to Tomas's second question, but actually I think Congressman Sarbanes' question is a really useful one, which is maybe for you all to reflect, because you've already indicated that fellow students are listening to your work or learning about it. And I mean, this is not really an opportunity, but you're welcome to reflect on the ways in which project learning by doing, is helping you or not get a handle on what are really incredibly complex problems. I think every one of you at some point this semester already has had a moment where you thought, it seems like to me anyway, watching you, listening, that this is a whole lot more complicated than we started with. And that is a good thing, but it's also really a challenge thing. So, you know, I think one of the questions might be, as Congressman Sarbanes asked, you know, how do you think that there is a bigger mobilization or opportunity in civic education itself with this type of work that you're doing? And just, you know, this open-ended question. If you could, and raise your, we got Haley on that one.
Yes, so I absolutely think that there's some room for larger civic education, especially with our project on misinformation, which I think is a really big problem in just about everything in public life right now. So in doing the work and like going through different sites for social media and finding these, finding misinformation and reporting it, you learn that there's a lot of different types and that they really target people in different ways, either through looking professional or targeting people through fear or through pride. And so I think there's a lot of room for educating people on how they find information and just how we choose to educate ourselves in general, whether it's the news sources that we go or it's making sure that you don't confirm your own bias. And I think there's a lot of room for us all to grow just in general, which is something that I know our group is really excited to start working on.
Can I just a quick follow-up on that, and or Tomas and Congressman Sarbanes? I'm struck, Haley, that you are you coming to terms with your own biases in the course of doing this research?
Yes, that's something that's been really difficult when you're going through these sites and you're seeing the posts that other people put up. It's really easy to want something to be taken down because you don't agree with it. So you have to like walk that thin line of, is it wrong or do you just not agree with it? So censoring out your own bias and being very careful to respect other people's opinions while still wanting the truth to come out and knowing the difference between those two things.
You summarize a broader dilemma. Beautifully said, Haley. Thank you. Tomas and Congressman Sarbanes, do you want to respond to any of these insights so far before we go to the last question?
I just had a couple of quick thoughts, Gunther. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. So I was very intrigued by this idea that in the midst of all the obstacles being thrown at people, there's an empowerment in pushing back. And I think in a lot of ways, what happened with the U.S. Postal Service is an example of this. When people became aware that there appeared to be a concerted effort with the Postmaster General to sort of undermine the Postal Service's ability to process mail. What was interesting is it was almost kind of a reaction of extra determination on the part of, I think, large portions of the electorate. It's almost like the more you challenge me with the idea that I can't get to the ballot box, the more determined and creative I will become in making sure I do get there. And so I think that's sort of the other side of these efforts at voter suppression that we've seen creatively deployed over the last few years, is it can in fact make the electorate stand up and push back even harder. So I've definitely seen that in my own district and kind of responding to some of those things. The other thing that is a really interesting topic, and I think candidates like myself are drawn to this, is this new conventional wisdom that's emerging that you got to be careful not to shame the voter based on sort of their past involvement, because it really turns on its head what has been a best practice in a lot of campaigns, which is, you're calling people, you're saying, I see where you didn't vote, last year or in the primary, what can we do to get you to vote? And this sort of notion of peer pressure or guilt being deployed down the home stretch is something that we've held on to as being effective. And I think there's a lot of learning happening now that it actually is counterproductive, and there's better, sort of more empowering, more positive oriented ways that you can motivate people to get out and cast their ballot. So I was very interested in that discussion on the call as well.
Thank you. Tomas.
One of the things that stayed with me was, like, I think like Congressman Sarbanes said, this idea, of the positivity and sort of the positive reinforcement. One of the students was talking about kind of how people don't want to admit they didn't vote. There's kind of a social acceptability to voting, which I think is, not a giant revolution, but is a step forward, right, in sort of hearing that, that exists in the cohort. And I think where it's made me think about, right, is that there is this we're seeing in our work right now, one of the things that we do is we operate a voter assistance hotline. Number is 888-OUR-VOTE, and you have volunteer lawyers operating it, and we're getting now upwards of 200 calls a day, which for this time, right, which is, not in-person voting is not happening. It is a very, very high volume. And in fact, we were having really quite high volume, even going back to August, we were getting, 60 plus calls a day, and before anybody was voting. And what all that says to me, and I think what a lot of what I'm hearing here too, is that like people, one way to read it is that, okay, yeah, people are really concerned and they're worried about the voting rules, but also that like people really want to get it right. That people really, I think like Congressman Sarbanes, was kind of getting at like that. If people do, want to be heard, and they're willing to, take steps in order to do so, both in, at least in the individual sense and perhaps in the collective sense as well. And I think that may be sort of in the coming weeks, I think something for you all, the students to think about, right? Is this idea, okay, people want to get it right. What can we ask of people?
It's a great question. Can I ask a quick question for both you and Congressman Sarbanes, which I think would be relevant to all of our students, which is, what have you, both of you, as really lifelong advocates for democracy, what have you learned through failure? When you had an expectation and it wasn't met? Not only failure at the ballot box, I mean failure in terms of the learning you've done. Because I think I just want to say there's a lot of courage, wisdom, and risk involved in the kinds of pilots that these students are putting together. And they may be wrong in terms of what they expect. They may get a different outcome. But like, what, if you have any reflections on how that has worked in your own careers, I think that'd be really interesting to hear.
Gunther, this is JP, Congressman Sarbanes. I think what you have to do is just be very honest in doing the post-mortem. Like when you fail, particularly in an advocacy space, what can happen, it's natural, and it operates particularly strongly in an advocacy space, is you get so caught up in the effort to persuade, particularly down the home stretch of whatever that project or outreach is. You don't want to let go of or tinker with or adjust your key message frame or the key elements of your case to the audience, because you're in a very intense mode. But if that fails, if it's not persuasive to the audience, or in other ways you fall short, you really have to step back and reevaluate maybe where the message was wrong, or maybe where you didn't listen as carefully on the front end when you were building the case before you kind of took it out for a spin. And that means oftentimes going to the same audience where you failed and asking them to explain what didn't connect, what didn't work, and listen very carefully, and then adjust it for the next round of advocacy that you undertake. And it can be hard, and it takes some courage to go out to an audience that has, in a sense, rejected the appeal you've made to them, and engage them again and listen and learn from that. But the people I've seen who are most effective over the long term are people who do that. They understand it's an iterative process of trying to get it right, and that also conditions change from one minute to the next, and you've got to always be ready to pivot and adapt to that. So that would be my observation on it.
Thank you. Very wisdom there. Tomas, do you want to reflect on that question?
Yeah, I was going to say Congressman Sarbanes gave a very Hart Leadership Program answer by talking about reflection. And and that's probably where I would go to a similar place, which is to, and it's really kind of telling myself two things that, in light of when things don't work out the way that I want them to. One is, reminding myself, hey, like, if it were the way I wanted it to be, I wouldn't be doing it. Right. And that is to say, I think, particularly in the advocacy context, right, there are people who view things differently. And, that is a fact of that, that is just a fact of life. And the second is, really to, be able to sort of draw out the through line from, there's this idea, that people probably heard it, right? Failing forward, right? What is, the idea of a total failure, right, is a tough one. It's really thinking about, what is the next step. That a lot of these things aren't necessarily terminal. So much of this work, it goes beyond one given project, and it says, okay, it changes. It may change the outcome may change what the next project is, what the next chapter looks like, but remembering that we are playing a long game.
Well said. Thank you so much to the panelists. I want to also just give Professor Deandra Rose the final word to close us out. Thank you to all of the students. I wish we had chance and time for questions. I would encourage you to contact the students or contact us if you have thoughts and insights about these works of progress in action. Professor Deandra Rose, are you there? Deandra.
I'm right here. Thanks so much, Professor Peck. I want to just send a few thank yous to close us out. First, to every single team that shared these amazing projects with us. Thank you so much for the opportunity to learn from you today. Thank you for the work that you're doing and for demonstrating that you can do research as democracy work. So I think we love that and just benefit from what you're doing. Also, to the entire Hart leadership team, Gunther, Anna, Lalita, to our special guests, Tomas, Lopez, Representative Sarbanes, to Alexandra Cooper at SSRI. We're thankful for all of your work and your willingness to be a part of our day. And for all of our attendees, please join us right here at 4:30 for the next panel, in which we will have PhD candidates sharing some of their research related to voting. And then finally at 6 o'clock, we'll have Professor Guy Charles from Duke University's Law School, who's going to be giving our keynote address. So we hope that you'll join us then. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a good day.